There was a time when violence was no longer hidden behind closed doors. It stood in plain sight, declared righteous, and clothed in the language of law. Crowds gathered, cameras clicked, and the world pretended to look away, all the while calling it justice. Yet beneath the surface, beneath the words and the ceremonies, there was a system at work. One designed not to punish crime, but to enforce hierarchy. It reminded an entire group of people of their place. This was a society where fear was currency, and silence was complicity. Where power did not rely on morality, but on the collective agreement to see but not intervene, to witness but not act. Power, in its most insidious form, rarely appears as force alone. It disguises itself in ritual, in narrative, in the stories that communities tell themselves about safety, order, and protection.
Those who rise above the expected boundaries are quickly reminded that society's approval is conditional, that advancement invites scrutiny, suspicion, and sometimes punishment. Violence becomes a message, precise, deliberate, and public. It communicates far more than anger ever could. It delineates boundaries, enforces roles, and creates an unmistakable warning. Step out of line, and there will be consequences. And these consequences are not only physical. They ripple across communities, shaping perception, molding behavior, and ensuring that fear, once implanted, becomes internalized.
This mechanism relies heavily on narrative. The crowd does not act in a vacuum. Rumors, accusations, and moral panics provide justification for acts that would otherwise be unimaginable. A story of danger, threat, or impropriety is repeated and amplified until it no longer matters whether it is true. Its power comes from belief, not reality. When society convinces itself that one group is inherently dangerous, violent acts against them are transformed from crimes into duties. The individual becomes a symbol. Their punishment becomes an instrument of order. And the spectacle, the public display, the photographs, the cheering, all of it reinforces the system, embedding the act into social consciousness as both warning and entertainment. Fear, in this context, functions as a social regulator. It is not random, it is calculated. When a community witnesses a violation of social norms, the response is not merely to correct behavior through legal mechanisms, but to create a culture of obedience through terror. Public violence enforces conformity. It shapes everyday decisions, dictates mobility, influences work, and controls ambition. The lessons extend far beyond the immediate victim. Everyone who observes is reminded of the consequences of challenging hierarchy. Fear is contagious, yet its spread is invisible, often justified under the guise of protection, morality, or necessity. The more normalized it becomes, the less it is questioned, until the crowd itself begins to act as both enforcer and observer, perpetuating the cycle without reflection.
Silence is equally crucial. The absence of intervention, the refusal to speak, to record, or to condemn, is itself a form of participation. Societies can permit atrocity not only through action, but through inaction. When the majority remains silent, the minority bears the cost. Silence validates the message of fear. It confirms that the social order is intact and that the power structure is accepted. Individuals rationalize their passivity with claims of helplessness, detachment, or neutrality. Yet neutrality in such a system is never innocent.
The line between observer and participant blurs. To witness without resisting is to consent. These dynamics reveal the intersection between individual behavior and structural forces. Violence in such societies is rarely spontaneous. It is embedded in the institutions, in the expectations, in the cultural rituals that sustain them. Public punishment, collective fear, and communal silence are mechanisms that perpetuate hierarchy. They operate alongside legal structures, economic systems, and political rhetoric to produce an environment where oppression appears natural, inevitable, and justified. Those who benefit from the hierarchy rarely question it. Those who suffer often have little recourse. Power is maintained not merely through laws or coercion, but through social acceptance of cruelty as order. The moral justification of such acts often relies on constructed narratives. Societies create myths to rationalize inequality, to frame aggression as protection, and to depict victims as threats. False accusations become the language of control. Each repetition of the myth strengthens the perceived legitimacy of the system. Through collective acceptance, these myths transform into accepted truths. The lie is institutionalized, and the social structure itself becomes complicit in its propagation. What begins as rumor becomes a scaffold for social behavior, dictating who can rise, who must remain subservient, and who can be punished without question. One of the most disturbing aspects of this system is its ability to normalize brutality. The crowd learns to see violence as ordinary, as a mechanism for maintaining peace, rather than as injustice. Spectacle becomes social education. Young observers internalize these lessons, understanding that compliance ensures safety, deviation invites harm, and silence maintains order. Over time, morality bends to utility. Empathy is conditioned by survival. Violence is no longer exceptional. It is routine, a structural necessity. In such a society, the boundaries between right and wrong are dictated not by conscience, but by collective approval. The psychological dimensions of such systems are equally profound. Fear and violence shape identity and behavior. They produce conformity, suppress dissent, and regulate ambition. The constant threat of reprisal compels self-censorship, curtails resistance, and channels social energy into obedience. Communities internalize hierarchy. The subjugated begin to regulate their own behavior, preemptively avoiding conflict or perceived transgression. Control becomes internalized, and the social order perpetuates itself without constant intervention. In essence, the mechanisms of fear achieve permanence through the minds of the people, ensuring stability without continuous application of force. Moreover, the collective rituals surrounding violence reinforce social cohesion among the dominant group. Public acts of aggression become opportunities for affirmation, for witnessing shared values, and for reinforcing solidarity. The crowd's participation is not merely passive, it is performative, ritualistic, and integrative. In witnessing or endorsing the acts, individuals confirm their allegiance to the social hierarchy, demonstrating loyalty and reinforcing their own position within the power structure. The act of observing becomes a social mechanism that validates both the behavior of the perpetrators and the order they seek to maintain. These patterns demonstrate how structural oppression is maintained through cultural, psychological, and social mechanisms simultaneously. Violence is codified not only in the act itself, but in the attitudes, narratives, and social norms surrounding it. Silence, fear, rumor, and ritual work in tandem to create an environment where injustice is perpetuated and reinforced. Power in such contexts is less about the authority of laws than about the consent of the governed. Consent manufactured through fear, belief, and communal reinforcement.
Even when legal systems ostensibly exist to prevent abuse, they often fail to intervene effectively. Courts remain silent, law enforcement is complicit or indifferent, and public opinion aligns with the dominant narrative. The social system fills the gaps left by institutions. In this way, societal norms and public sentiment are as powerful as legal codes in enforcing hierarchy. Punishment and suppression are enacted not merely by individuals, but by the collective, the crowd, the community. The structure itself ensures compliance, transforming social fear into a mechanism of control. These dynamics extend beyond immediate acts of violence. They shape economic opportunity, political participation, and social mobility. Communities internalize expectations of behavior, restrict aspirations, and anticipate reprisal. Fear becomes preventative. It regulates ambition and ensures conformity long before any overt act of aggression. Individuals learn the boundaries of permissible behavior and the costs of transgression. In effect, the social environment becomes both a regulator and an enforcer, maintaining the hierarchy even when direct intervention is not present. Patterns of moral panic illustrate how societies construct justification for oppression. False narratives, exaggerated threats, or moralized fears are amplified to legitimize the actions of the powerful. By convincing the public that a particular group is dangerous, society rationalizes its suppression. The morality of the act is reframed. Cruelty becomes responsibility, violence becomes protection, and oppression becomes order. The legitimacy of the hierarchy depends not on truth, but on belief. Collective acceptance transforms moral panic into a tool of social control. The lessons of such a system are enduring. Societies can perpetuate inequality without explicit laws. Violence can be normalized, even celebrated, when sanctioned by collective belief. Silence validates injustice. Fear enforces hierarchy, and myth maintains the moral framework needed to rationalize oppression. These mechanisms ensure that power persists beyond individual actors, beyond specific incidents, and into the very structures of culture and expectation. Ultimately, the study of these patterns reveals the fragile boundaries between legality, morality, and social consensus. Acts of violence, when embedded in communal belief and ritual, cease to appear as exceptions. They become instruments of social organization. Control is maintained not through constant threat alone, but through the internalization of hierarchy, the normalization of fear, and the complicity of those who witness without acting. The system sustains itself because it transforms participation and observation into mechanisms of compliance, ensuring that power remains unchallenged and injustice becomes routine. History teaches us that these systems are neither accidental nor isolated. They emerge when fear is allowed to dominate reason, when narrative substitutes truth, and when society collectively endorses hierarchy through both action and inaction. Understanding these patterns is not only about recording past atrocities, it is about recognizing the structural mechanisms that allow oppression to persist. Power is reinforced when cruelty is normalized, when silence is sustained, and when fear dictates social order. To witness is to participate, and to remain indifferent is to enable. Even as the specifics change over time, the underlying dynamics remain. Rumors, moral panics, fear, and collective complicity continue to shape the world. The lessons remain relevant. Societies regulate behavior, enforce hierarchy, and perpetuate inequality not only through laws or formal systems, but through culture, narrative, and shared belief. Violence may change form, but the mechanisms of control endure.
teaching the same lesson over and over. Power is maintained not by justice, but by fear, silence, and acceptance.
The boundaries of human behavior are shaped not only by rules, but by the threat of reprisal and social judgment. Communities learn to monitor themselves, to self-censor, and to internalize the expectations imposed by those in power. Deviance is not just punished externally, it is anticipated and suppressed internally. In this way, fear becomes both invisible and omnipresent, governing not only actions, but thoughts, ambitions, and interactions. Power manifests not only in acts of aggression, but in the social agreement to accept hierarchy. Public complicity, silence, and normalization of violence ensure that the system continues without constant enforcement. The mechanisms of control evolve, adapting to context, but their essence remains the same: to ensure the dominant group remains unchallenged and the subordinate remains constrained.
The study of these patterns illuminates the subtle ways in which societies regulate themselves. Fear, rumor, ritual, and silence are more than cultural artifacts. They are instruments of social engineering. Violence, when contextualized within these mechanisms, becomes a predictable and maintainable feature of social order. And when morality bends to social expectation, cruelty becomes normalized and injustice becomes routine. Ultimately, the enduring lesson is this: societies can maintain hierarchy without overt coercion, and injustice persists when complicity is silent. Violence may evolve, forms may change, but the principles remain. Fear sustains control, narrative legitimizes cruelty, and silence protects the guilty. Understanding these patterns is essential because recognizing them is the first step toward preventing them from repeating.